Hey guys, welcome back to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host Alan Bishop, the channel where we hope to entice you into becoming more involved in the art of distillation, whether you be a home distiller or a professional distiller. The deeper your level of involvement, the deeper your passion goes, the more interesting your products become, and the more pride you have in putting them in front of people, right? So I was talking earlier to my good buddy John Miller, the real deal John Miller, and we were talking about some of these channels that are out there. There's a lot of us smaller channels now that aren't Jesse from Still It or Barley and Hops or Beard and Board, and love all those guys and huge following that they have. But we're talking about there's a lot of room here for all of us, for every one of us that's wanting to get into doing this and helping with distillers that are either just beginning or that are more advanced or somewhere in between. But I think on these channels we're sharing a lot of the same viewers. And what's interesting enough is I think it almost becomes like a graduate class, right? You're going to have guys that are really want to stick to that traditional moonshine thing, the sugar shine thing, whether it be with the real deal John Miller or it be with still an old school. You're going to have guys like the Alambic Diary who are more into doing traditional all grain fermentations and distillations or brandies and things of that nature. And then you're going to have folks like me who I'm kind of all over the map, right? And I'm very, very involved in every style of distillation that I possibly theoretically could be without just losing my mind and having no time for myself or my family whatsoever. Um, so that being said, one of the things that I'm working on is I got some inspiration from John Miller. John Miller is running a great malt company. It's called Stakey Creek Heritage Malt, and he's doing a lot of traditional Appalachian style malted corn and smoked malted corn. He's also doing malted wheat and rye and barley and all those things out of East Tennessee, and it's awesome. And that's really where his focus is going to go towards doing a lot of that stuff. I distill for a living, so I don't really have to focus on making money off those things. But what I am trying to do is I'm trying to bring all of my sort of outside of work distilling enterprises underneath one umbrella, right? So a place for distiller stock, a place for One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute, a place for like the Alan Bishop experience, a place for the historic talks, the reenactments, the consulting, all of that sort of thing. We are doing that with a website. We are launching a new podcast at some point in time. It may or may not be distilling related. It may be a little distilling related and a little bit not distilling related. We'll see. If I've got the equipment, I can do a little bit of everything, right? So with that in mind, we're wanting to come up with some merchandise. So we've done some one-off stickers in the past, whether they be kind of my more dark sense of humor or they be a little bit more serious. Mud Fossil and you know, I can't even say it say it without laughing. Um, Mud Fossil and Duffy Woods, sort of stuff, that kind of thing. But also, more home distilling based limited run products as well. I think that might be kind of cool. Things that might get you guys a little bit more involved in the art of distilling. Nothing on the scale of what John Miller's doing, but what we might do, for example, other than obviously the hats and bandanas and shirts and stickers and that kind of stuff, for the home distillers, we may start offering some unique ingredients, and we may only offer them on a very small scale. Some malted Elise corn, for example, would be cool, or Flint corn, the corn that I'm working on now, or malted Amanda Palmer corn, maybe a gallon at a time. Not enough that you can do an all grain out of, but certainly if you're doing a sugar shine, you can throw this stuff in. It's going to have its own unique flavor, be something different, and get you thinking and going, man, maybe I should be growing some of my own corn and malting some of my own corn. The other thing we're going to do is I've been working on a way of making powdered yeast from the yeast strains that I do cultivate myself. I'm no microbiologist. By no means are these strains more than likely pure. I don't expect them to be. You also shouldn't expect them to be. This is true, traditional, practical distiller sort of stuff. If I can get that where I want it at, I intend to offer you guys samples of those yeast strains that you can use at home, to where maybe you can take that Elise malt corn and you can take that particular yeast strain and you can put them together into your sugar shine. And again, this gives you a new light on sugar shine and being able to step up to something else. Or feel free to use them in all grain. It's all good by me one way or the other. We also grow a lot of different botanicals here for absinthe and gin and things of that nature. We may offer some of those very limited, just to get you guys interested in doing some more of those botanical style distillations as well. That being said, we're 4 minutes and 38 seconds into this video, and I have not gotten to the question today. So I believe that this question is from Steve Givens. If I'm wrong, please correct me. Says, Alan, a question for your thoughts for one of your sessions. Considering a spirit like bourbon that has laws saying certain processes and ingredients are required to be sold as bourbon, growing up around older family and friends who were whiskey drinkers, I always heard, quote unquote, it's all corn whiskey. Some folks really like one brand over another, and some dislike bourbon completely. Other than personal taste, what does a distiller think that really separates taste in different brands of bourbon from one another? Thanks, friend. So this is a very bourbon-centric question, and one that I do feel qualified to answer. Being a bourbon distiller myself, even if I am quote-unquote on the wrong side of the river, we can get into that some other time, the history of bourbon and where all it really originated from, because it's not just one place. So that being said, if you think about bourbon on a spectrum historically, you go back to 1850, you've got a lot of farm distillers, you got a lot of light industrial distillers. The spectrum of bourbon is very wide as far as the styles of grains that they're using, the malt that they're able to get a hold of, whether or not they have to adjust those mash bills. A lot of times back in those days, mash bills were not hard, fast, and set the way they are now. They may have changed depending upon what crops were available or weren't available, how well actually converted the malt would have been, what the specific gravity would have been of the wash that they were making, whether they thought they needed to take that a little higher or whatever. So the spectrum was very wide, to the extent that the second most grown crop in both Indiana and Kentucky at that time was oats. And the reason it was such a widely grown crop is because it was used a lot in bourbon whiskey, and very rarely nowadays do you see oats in bourbon whiskey. Once you get up to about 1870, 1880, you get into low rectification Kentucky column still. This is the big column still, the tall columns. There's a fly keeps landing on the camera, guys. That's why I'm doing this. I apologize. Anyways, those are the big tall columns that you'll see at the commercial distilleries nowadays. They do not work the same way as a pot still. You don't make hard cuts off of those like you do a pot still. In other words, you know, 4 shots heads, hard stills, etc. What you do though is you tune those stills to run a certain way, to run the condenser at certain temperatures, and to be able to actually vaporize and get rid of some of the volatile components such as acetaldehyde, ethyl acetate that you don't want, to be able to gasify those, put them out in the atmosphere, not condense them with the liquid you want to actually put in the barrel. That started to shrink down the spectrum of bourbon because it becomes more efficient, right? And now it's a game of efficiency amongst distillers. You got to keep up with the times and stay on top of things to be economically relevant to your customers, which is fine. That's why oats disappear, because they're a little harder to run through a column still. They tend to get a little thicker, they tend to be a little stickier. Rye can do the same thing, but it just made more sense to stick with, you know, either a very high corn content bourbon, or a high rye content bourbon, or a low rye content bourbon, and even wheated bourbons, which did not start at Stitzel-Weller, by the way. They're way older than that. Moving past that point, once you get up to Prohibition and after Prohibition, you basically have 6 large bourbon distilleries. Now, there were other large distilleries in the United States, different places, even after Prohibition. But when it comes to bourbon, it was really centered in Kentucky at that time. Now, the thing about that is, a lot of those distilleries, of those 6, I believe 5 had beans working for them. And as such, they got their yeast strain from the same place at that time. It was really the bean yeast strain. All of them to this day claim to still be using the same yeast strain. Even if they don't propagate it themselves, they have a lab that propagates it, etc. And so that's going to take away that variable. That variable is now gone. Secondarily, what happens is they're all running those same mash bills, or within a few points of one another, right? The same 3 or 4 mash bills that you're familiar with to this day. So their variables come down to, how's that still tuned? How much of the volatile substances are you driving off to the atmosphere? What char are you using? Using a 3 or a 4 char, because most of them use a 3 or 4 char. What's your barrel entry proof? A lot of them went to 125 to save money on barrels by not adding water, or as much water to the whiskey, and using more barrels. And then where at in the warehouses are those barrels placed? And are the warehouses either heated, not heated? Are they stone, or brick, or are they tin clad? Where at in the warehouse are the barrels, bottom or the top, right? Those are the only variables they really have to change the flavors of their bourbon. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and I love Kentucky bourbon. Those guys have the world at their fingertips, right? But that spectrum of bourbon came down to this until the craft distillers came back up. Things went back to more like what they were in the 1850s, where now craft distillers, we can play with yeast, we can play with secondary fermentation, we can play with fermentation temperatures, we can play with pot stills and 3-chamber stills and cut points and proofing down to go into the barrel, and what proof produces the best whiskey, and non-chill filtration and proofing down very slowly. And then obviously the big thing that's happened recently is finishing in bourbon whiskey. I hope that answered your question. I know that was kind of a quick version. If you want me to go deeper on that, let me know and I'll go as deep as I can. Till then, if you have questions, bishopshomegrown@gmail.com, or any of my social media, or in the YouTube comments, guys. Love y'all. Have a good one.